Hello everyone and welcome to a new tutorial. Yes, based on the feedback from my previous video, the vlog, I'm going to be doing some more FL Studio tutorials. So cool. However, the plan for this particular video is to try to go into some concepts about sound and synthesis and what's happening when we're actually running all this audio processing stuff in FL Studio. And why are we going to study this very low-level basic stuff? Because it's really vital in understanding how to tailor your sounds, how to come up with ideas for sounds to generate, and how to process them and get new sounds, understanding what's actually happening when we add limiters and EQs, and when we synthesize sawtooth waves and square waves and all this stuff and try to put together an interesting sound. There is a lot of myth about sound that I'm trying to dispel in this video. So we're going to be learning about some concepts that would be taught in something like an audio engineering course. Some of them would be taught in something like an electronic or electrical engineering course. However, we'll be approaching it from a very informal standpoint. And it's tailored towards, FL Studio and making interesting sounds. And I think this will be very useful because in the next couple of videos I want to go into some synthesis, some more advanced synthesis concepts and effects. So, before we move on, we have to understand what these sounds are actually made of before we can move on to sculpt them and make more interesting sounds and add effects. We have to understand what are we actually modifying, what are these sounds built up of. So the most simple example I can think of is to add a 3x channel here. Turn down the volume on the second and third oscillators. And the first one, set it to sinusoid here, the first shape, the sine wave. And we're going to program in some notes. What is this? What are we actually listening to here? It's a very, very pure sound. But why is it pure? And the way to understand why it sounds like a very simple sound is to look at what's called a spectrogram. And to look at that, we have to add a plugin called Wave Candy. By the way, there are other plugins that can do spectrograms. This is the built-in FL Studio one. And we're going to load this plugin on the master track here. And make this window bigger. I'm going to set the opacity here higher so it's a black background. And make sure here in the options it's set to spectrum. So we're looking at the spectrum of this wave. Actually, before we look at the spectrum, let's look at the actual waveform. So in this oscilloscope view, we see that the wave, when it changes frequency, goes between different wavelengths. It becomes shorter, its periods become shorter and higher. That's what the frequency is, how fast this basic wave is repeating. So we've got time here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis there's amplitude. Or how loud, not really how loud, but how intense, what the level of the waveform actually is at that point in time. So this doesn't really tell us anything, it just tells us, oh, the frequency probably changes, and we look at what the waveform looks like. But to have an understanding of what this wave is actually built up of and why it sounds so pure, we have to go into the spectrum view. So let's look at, let's play and see what comes out. So if you look here in this corner, we have these lines. And what these lines are telling us is where, in this range of frequencies from 20 Hz to about 22 kHz, is the sound, is there energy in the sound? And we can see that this sine wave only has energy at about up to 2 kHz. It doesn't go any higher than that, and those are actually the frequencies of my sine wave. And you can see that my sine wave only has a peak at the frequency that it's at. That's the only point we see the line on this range of frequencies. This is why the sine wave is such a pure sound, because it's only that energy. That's all we have. And for comparison, let's try using a triangle wave here, and let's play it again. So we see here that in the spectrum, there's not just one frequency. We don't care if our wave has a frequency of 400 Hz, because actually, this more complex waveform contains more frequency components. It's actually got more sine waves in it. So what this shows us is that all sounds, including my voice right now that you're hearing, is built up of those basic sine waves. The sine wave is the building block of all sound. That's really important to understand. So this triangle wave sounds meatier. It sounds more interesting and more complex because its spectrum is more complex. But keep in mind that the spectrum of the triangle wave is a harmonic relationship. So it's quite a static spectrum. It doesn't change much, and it's a very simple relationship with the fundamental frequency. So the fundamental frequency being the base frequency of our wave, the lowest frequency. It's called the fundamental frequency. And all the harmonics in these various types of waves are integer multiples of various type. Let's look at the square wave for a second. Let's put the square wave on and listen to it and look at the spectrogram. You see here a much more complex spectrum. However, we also hear something horrible. We hear that here, when the frequency goes much higher, there's this ringing sound, this nastiness in the spectrum and in the sound. And we can see here that aside from our actual harmonics, the main peaks here, we have this dirtiness in between them. And what that's called aliasing. And the reason for this happening is because this square wave, like most sounds, has an infinite number of harmonics. It doesn't have harmonics just going up to this 20 kilohertz range. It has harmonics that go up to infinity. However, my computer cannot represent this. My computer can only represent, or FL Studio rather, can only represent up to about 22 kilohertz. Anything above this, called the Nyquist rate, is reflected backwards into the spectrum as aliasing artifacts. And one easy way to understand and view what's actually happening is to go back to the sine wave and go back into the piano roll, delete all these notes, program in this long note, and make a slide from here up to the very highest note possible in FL Studio. And we're also going to turn the coarse tune knob on the first oscillator to about plus 12 to make it even higher. So let's see what happens when this fundamental frequency, this sine wave on its own, goes above the limit of our reproduction here. That's weird, right? Our frequency was actually going up. I was trying to generate a higher note. However, here we can see that the frequency reflected, and then reflected again when it reached 0 here. This is an aliasing artifact, and this is what happens to all the harmonics in your sound. And because you're only sending, when you're doing a square wave, for example, only some of them get reflected backwards, and they become an inharmonic relationship, which makes your sound quite dirty. And this is why you always hear that higher sampling rates are better for audio equipment or for audio software. This is because the maximum frequency here, the Nyquist rate, is actually given by our sampling rate. The limit here is half the sampling rate. And in FL Studio, the sampling rate is visible in the audio settings, and in this case here it's 44.1 kilohertz. So half this is the highest frequency we can possibly represent without causing these nasty artifacts. This is really important. This is the main way, well, one of the main ways you can go really, really wrong when trying to generate interesting sounds, if you don't understand why this is happening. And when I was a beginner, I always thought, what the hell is going on? I'm getting these weird bird song sounds in the background. Well, it's because you have to be careful when you're generating your sounds. Thankfully, most plugins do not let you generate any sounds above 20 kilohertz. They just won't generate them, and it's fine. They're automatically anti-aliased. 3xOSC, however, this very basic plugin does not anti-alias, which is why this is happening. Thankfully, once again, when you actually render your project to an audio file FL Studio takes care of this and actually anti-aliases. This is only when you're actually listening to it, because it takes less CPU power to generate these simple sounds. But it's a good way to understand that all these sounds are built up of individual sine waves at various amplitudes and frequencies and phases, going into this range from about 20 Hz, which is the minimum frequency we can actually hear, up to above or around 20 kHz, which is about the maximum we can hear. Anything above that we won't be able to hear, but if you're unlucky to use a plugin that's badly programmed, it'll cause these weird artifacts. Let's go back. Let's use a different plugin now so we don't run into this problem. Let's use let's use Citrus. Let's look at a more interesting sound. Let's look at what this string sound looks like. This is a much more complex spectrum. It doesn't have that basic harmonic relationship that the sawtooth wave or the square wave has. However, you can still kind of tell in the spectrum. If you look carefully, there are still very clear lines. This is because this string sound, even though it sounds quite complex, is actually built up of a bunch of sawtooth waves and other types of waves. And this is why analog synthesis and all this basic type of synthesis still sounds quite artificial. An actual violin sound is much more complex than this. This is a very poor imitation of a string ensemble, and we can tell just from looking at the spectrum. So that's the main power of being able to understand what a spectrogram actually shows you. This is your sound. This is what your sound looks like and what's actually contained within it. Now, before we move on, let's look at some more examples. Let's look at some voice. I'm going to use this sampler channel, and I'm going to load up one of the basic voice samples from FL Studio. Infectious.
Infectious.
I'll give you pleasure.
Yeah, let's use this one. Let's put it on repeat here. Oops.
I'll give you pleasure.
You can drag it right from the waveform view here. Let's just put this on repeat and listen to that lovely voice over and over.
Pleasure. I'll give you pleasure.
You can see the spectrum is really complex. There's very little harmonic relationships in this. There are some, because the voice does have a fundamental frequency, but it's a much more complex spectrum. One cool thing is that you can scale this up.
Pleasure.
So you can look at the lower parts of the
Pleasure, 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 pleasure.
Spectrum.
I'll give you pleasure.
Let's load a longer wave file. This is a bit too short.
Reporting district, division plus master B.
There's a poem somewhere in here. What's this knob do?
No.
Yeah, let's look at this one, spoken word.
Melting to the imprisoned image of a damaged mind, ravaged by an unforgiving time, expressed divinely, by a man, not a god, but wrapped so timely, in the sinews of my aching body's course to travel blindly.
Let's scale it down a bit.
Melting to the imprisoned image of a damaged mind, ravaged by an unforgiving time, expressed divinely, by a man, not a god.
So once again, we see that the human voice has a fundamental frequency and a couple of immediate harmonics here, with a lot of other weirdness in the background. So it's a much more interesting sound that's hard to reproduce with. This is why we have trouble reproducing a human voice, because there's no good mathematical model for synthesizing all this precise stuff. A couple of other settings here are the resolution, and you can experiment
Melting
with
to
this.
the
It essentially says how good the representation of the spectrum is.
Melting to the imprisoned image of a damaged mind, ravaged by an unforgiving time, expressed divinely, by a man, not a god, but wrapped so timely.
Hold button here holds it so it doesn't move, because this actually, it shows you the variance over how the spectrum varies over time, as opposed to just one line of one spectrum. So if you press hold here, it holds it and you can look at something that happened.
Melting to the imprisoned image of a damaged mind, ravaged by an unforgiving time, expressed divinely, by a man, not a god, but wrapped so timely, in the
If we were looking at the oscilloscope view of this,
melting to the imprisoned image of a damaged mind.
it's completely unuseful. There's nothing here that tells us anything about this sound. So, so let's finish with this. The spectrum is a very useful tool. It tells us a lot about our sounds, and we're going to use it in these lessons, and I'm probably going to try to use it in all my tutorials, just so you have a better idea of what I'm doing in terms of sound, in terms of timbre, and in terms of the spectrum of the sound.
Expressed divinely by a man, not a god, but wrapped so timely in the sinews of my aching body's course to travel blindly.
Let's finish with one more example, though. Let's add 3x osc again, and set the first oscillator to noise, and turn off all the other ones, and play it. We can see that the noise spectrum is a very widespread. It's a spectrum that has energy everywhere. It's a constant thing. It changes over time, but it fills the whole spectrum. That's what noise looks like. And we can see that this particular type of noise that they've chosen for the plugin actually has frequencies that are attenuated the lower they go. Now let's see what happens if I add a filter here. So I'm going to go into the Instrument Properties tab here in 3xosc. In the filter section, I'm going to choose a low pass filter, LP. And I'm going to play a sound, and I'm going to mess around with the cutoff knob, and we can finally see what exactly is happening when I use a filter and I vary its cutoff frequency. So the filter, the cutoff frequency, essentially says how much the high frequency content is attenuated and how far does the attenuation happen. Let's look at this again. So the lower the cutoff frequency, the more high frequency content is removed. So the cutoff frequency is the frequency where the filter is reducing the energy of the spectrum by about 6 decibels, I think. And you can vary that over time, and it gives you that classic low-pass filter sound. Now the resonance knob essentially adds a peak at the cutoff frequency. So let's turn the resonance high, and let's look at this again. Interesting, right? It does the same thing, but exactly where the cutoff frequency is, we get this peak. This is why we hear that ringing sound, because we hear the ringing sound at the cutoff frequency, where the peak is. Let's add a bandpass filter instead, and turn the resonance down again, and let's just look at what the cutoff frequency does. The bandpass filter only allows frequencies to pass within some certain range. So you can set where this generalized peak of past frequencies happens within the spectrum. Now the higher the resonance, the more you get this peak again. This is why, if we can bring this resonance high enough, we can actually generate a sine wave where this peak is. Because we end up making one very tiny area on the spectrum where all this energy is concentrated, and that's very similar to just having a sine wave there. If we go for the SVF LP times 2, this is a low-pass filter that attenuates frequencies more than the normal one. If we increase the resonance here and turn it down a bit because it's distorting, it's making almost a whistling sound. And again, this is because we've generated this peak here, which is a concentrated part of the spectrum, and it's pitched because we can definitely hear where the pitch is just from having this peak here. another useful thing you can do with spectrograms is see if one signal is buried within another. So let's just turn down all this filtering stuff. Yeah, so set it back to LP and turn the cutoff frequency to maximum so nothing gets attenuated. And let's add a sine wave. So turn up the volume on the second oscillator. So we can see where in our spectrum does the sine wave occur, but also the noise, because the signal contains both of these things. If we add another wave here, like a triangle wave, and turn the volume up, we can see everything in the spectrogram. So we see the noise, we see the sine wave, and we see the triangle wave as well. Let's play with some filters. So yeah, we can see all these different changes in the spectrum quite easily. The attenuation in the higher frequencies and all that stuff is very apparent. Alright, I think I'll stop here, and next video I'll look into some basic subtractive synthesis concepts, like making some more interesting sounds with 3xFOSS, like the ones I was just making now. And maybe some effects. So I hope that was useful to someone, and I'll see you next time.